Of the three groups journeying to Rome in the aftermath of Germanicus's death and Piso's attempted rebellion in the spring of 20 AD, Tiberius's son Castor was the first to arrive. Having completed his term as governor of Illyricum, Castor and his wife Livilla returned at the head of his victorious legion. His successful campaign against the Marcomanni of Germania had earned him an ovation, a prestigious honor granted by the Senate to celebrate his triumph. This recognition would coincide with his second term as Roman consul, further cementing his position as Rome's rising star, a welcome contrast to the shadow of grief looming over the empire. Because Castor, still holding proconsular imperium, was forbidden to cross the city's sacred boundary until his ovation, Tiberius travelled beyond the Pomerium to meet him. There, the emperor was greeted not only by his son, daughter-in-law and granddaughter, but also by Livilla's twin sons. The two baby boys, named Germanicus and Tiberius Gemellus, Gemellus meaning twin, had been born on the very day that Livilla's brother Germanicus had died in Syria. The birth of twins was hailed as a mark of divine favour, a symbol of extraordinary fortune tied to Rome's own founding twins, Romulus and Remus. For Tiberius, the arrival of his first grandsons on the very day his legal heir perished in Syria seemed an undeniable omen, a sign that despite the loss of Germanicus, the continuation of his legacy was assured. Yet, even in this moment of familial celebration, the spectre of betrayal lingered. Castor carried more than the triumph of his son's birth and his conquest of the Marcomanni. He also brought troubling news about Piso and Plancina. Granted safe passage by Gaius Sentius Saturninus to leave Calendaris and return to Rome, Piso's ship had instead veered toward Illyricum. There, accompanied by Plancina and their youngest son Marcus, Piso sought a private audience with Tiberius's son. But Castor, ever the astute statesman, refused to meet privately with an accused murderer and known rebel, a man who might later claim false promises had been made. Piso had clearly sought out Tiberius's son, now positioned as the empire's primary heir, in hopes of securing his support. Castor, however, insisted that the meeting take place before witnesses. "If certain insinuations be true," Castor declared, his voice raised for all to hear, "I must be foremost in my resentment." Then, with deliberate composure, he added, "But I prefer to believe these insinuations are false and groundless. The death of Germanicus need not be the ruin of anyone." Piso, Plancina, and their son Marcus joined Castor's legions on their march back to Rome. Along the way, they encountered the 9th Legion Hispania, recalled from Spain by Tiberius and reassigned to Africa to reinforce the 3rd Legion Augusta in its campaign against the Numidian Berber rebel, Tacfarinas. It was with the Hispania that Piso and his family parted ways with Castor and Livilla, choosing to continue their journey to Rome alongside the newly reassigned legion. Yet, by the time Castor and his legions arrived in Rome, the 9th Hispania had come and gone from the Campus Martius, and there was no sign of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. The next to arrive in Rome was Agrippina, Tiberius's widowed daughter-in-law, who brought with her a vast procession of mourners, some of whom had travelled as far as Brundisium. For nearly 2 months, the people of Rome, caught in their unrelenting grief, had awaited the arrival of Germanicus's ashes, devouring every report of Agrippina's progress along the way. As the duly elected consul of the year, Castor, alongside Germanicus's brother Claudius, had led the delegation of senators Tiberius sent to Terracina to escort the ashes on the final leg of Agrippina's journey. However, with the city already overcrowded and emotionally charged, Agrippina's procession threatened to ignite disaster. In response, Tiberius ordered an increase in the number of soldiers stationed in the city and dispatched units of the Praetorian Guard to redirect Agrippina's procession around the city's pomerium, guiding it directly onto the Campus Martius. As the sun set and darkness fell over the city, the torches blazing on the Campus Martius cast an orange hue across the sky. From the small portico he had constructed on the highest point of his Palatine villa, Tiberius could see the glow and hear the shrieks and wails of a nation in mourning. Nearly 100,000 people had gathered to witness the placement of Germanicus's ashes within the mausoleum of Augustus. They had come of their own accord, for Tiberius had declined the Senate's request to grant Germanicus a state funeral. For the previous 3 decades, the funerary excesses of the imperial family had become a competition, an exercise in growing extravagance. Following the death of Marcellus, the nephew and rumoured first heir of Augustus, a library had been dedicated to him by his grieving mother, and a newly constructed theatre along the Tiber River was named after him on the orders of his uncle, with an empty seat of honour maintained for his memory. Marcellus had also been written into Rome's law, immortalized by the poet Virgil. When Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandson, died in Gaul at the age of only 17, the Senate granted him a fully funded state funeral, despite his lack of a formal governmental position. The death of Gnaeus Caesar, Lucius's older brother, brought not only the expense of another state funeral, but the minting of commemorative coins and the voting of divine honours by the Senate. This act of deification was extended to include Lucius Caesar as well, though their cults never grew beyond symbolic honours. But this constant competition for posthumous glory drained the state's resources. Augustus alone was deemed worthy of a state funeral. The rest was a waste. Germanicus's death, decided Tiberius, demanded a different approach. Though he had been the heir, Germanicus died in service to Rome, like so many soldiers before him whose losses were mourned quietly by their families across the empire. Unlike the heirs of Augustus, whose passing sparked monumental displays of public grief, Germanicus's funeral needed to set a new standard for imperial mourning, one that would restore dignity and set a proper example for the future. Unfortunately for Tiberius, the Roman people did not agree. The lamentations that echoed against the orange glow of the Campus Martius were growing. The steady din of weeping was suddenly pierced by shrieks and wails, tinged with anger. "Where is Tiberius?" The question rang out, sharp and piercing. "And where is the Augusta? Why do they hide?" Another voice rose from the crowd. "They hide because this is their doing. They dare not show their faces, lest we see their delight." Finally, the ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus. Agrippina and her children then began making their way home, surrounded by throngs of hysterical mourners. From his perch atop the Palatine portico, Tiberius watched as the blazing torches dispersed, and he listened as the masses followed his daughter-in-law through the Forum Romanum. "Hail Agrippina!" they cried, "the glory of her nation! The only true descendant of the god Augustus!" Finally, just days after Germanicus's ashes had been placed in Augustus's mausoleum, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso and his family arrived in Rome. After parting ways with Tiberius's son, they had travelled with the 9th Hispania for a portion of the journey. Despite the rumours that clung to them, suggesting their involvement in the death of Germanicus, Piso, who outranked the military tribune leading the legions, rode proudly in a slave-borne litter at the head of the column, his wife Plancina by his side. Unapologetic and haughty, they must have been a sight to those soldiers who mourned the death of Germanicus. As they passed through the Apennine Mountains southeast of Rome, Piso, Plancina, and Marcus broke off from the 9th Hispania. They hired a boat to take them down the Nera River, the waterway that eventually fed into the Tiber, a silent passage toward the city that was both home and, for them, a place of reckoning. As if to make a statement, Piso chose to moor his boat at the small port beside the mausoleum of Augustus, the very spot where, only days before, the Roman people had vented their spleens over Germanicus's demise. Awaiting the arrival of his clientele, summoned by his eldest son Gnaeus, Piso stood unflinching. The air still hung with grief, and in the streets murmurs of accusations drifted like smoke, but Piso paid them no mind. Surrounded by a throng of clients and a detail of armed guards for their protection, Piso, Plancina, and Marcus made their way from the Campus Martius through the Forum Romanum. As they moved toward their home on the Lower Palatine, Piso spoke and laughed boisterously with those they passed, ensuring he was seen and heard by all. Arriving at their Palatine villa, occupied in their absence by their eldest son Gnaeus and his wife and new daughter, Piso and Plancina discovered their house was still decorated for the recently held Matronalia, the festival dedicated to the goddess Juno, celebrated annually at the end of March. While Piso, eager to make it clear that he had returned to Rome and would hide from no one, hosted a lavish banquet at his villa, his youngest son Marcus made his way to the imperial residence to request an audience with Tiberius. There, Marcus pleaded on his father's behalf, swearing that Piso's actions following Germanicus's death had been driven solely by a desire to stabilize the East in service to Rome. But Piso's actions had placed Tiberius in an impossible predicament. Germanicus was dead, and the grief-stricken people of Rome had begun to view Tiberius through the same lens as Piso, clouded with suspicion and resentment. If Tiberius failed to act swiftly, grief could spiral into open unrest and then riots. To protect himself and maintain order, he had to distance himself, not just from Piso, but also from Germanicus and Agrippina. "Tell your father," said Tiberius to Marcus Piso, voice imperiously impartial, "that prosecution is to be commenced against him at once." The atmosphere in Rome was electric as the Senate convened in an emergency session. With Germanicus dead and his remains interred, the city now buzzed with rumors of murder, of jealousy, and of treason, rumors that pointed directly to Tiberius Caesar. Two figures dominated the public imagination: Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, freshly arrived from the east and accused of having poisoned Germanicus, and Agrippina, the widow of Germanicus, whose dramatic return had captured the hearts of the people and the support of the legions. With both now in Rome, the stakes for the future of the empire could not have been higher. The people and the restless legions along the Rhine demanded Piso's prosecution. Yet, while public outrage burned bright, the Senate was paralyzed by fear, caught between their duty and the political danger of moving against popular opinion. Fulcinius Trio, an ambitious senator with close ties to Tiberius's powerful praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, seized the moment. Rising from his seat, he sought the Senate's permission to prosecute Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso and his wife, Munatia Plancina, for the murder of Germanicus. However, Quintus Veranius and Publius Vitellius, both former companions of Germanicus, swiftly objected. How could Trio, they argued, prosecute a crime committed in Syria when he had not been there? Veranius and Vitellius, who had been by Germanicus's side, insisted that only they could bring justice for his death. Before the Senate could respond, Fulcinius Trio withdrew his request, deferring graciously to Veranius and Vitellius. Undeterred, he pivoted, asking instead to prosecute Piso for misconduct during his governorship of Hispania. After all, there was no shortage of witnesses to his alleged crimes there. The Senate descended into chaos as the senators divided. Trio's motives were clear to many, an attempt to win public favor by attaching himself to the most scandalous trial in years. But Trio was no ordinary senator. He had built his career prosecuting treason cases uncovered by Sejanus. Since the trial of the Scribonius Libo brothers and the lucrative redistribution of their estates to their accusers, the faintest whisper of treason could ruin a man. Some senators reasoned it was safer to allow Trio his case, rather than risk finding their own names among Sejanus's accusations. Eventually, the Senate reached a decision. A delegation, including Fulcinius Trio, Quintus Veranius, Publius Vitellius, and several other senators, was dispatched to the home of Tiberius. The rest of the Senate remained behind, anxiously awaiting the emperor's guidance. Tiberius, flanked by a circle of trusted allies, received the delegation in the portico atop his Palatine villa. Standing above the city, with the Forum Romanum sprawling beneath him, he listened as Trio, Veranius, and Vitellius recounted the debates that had brought the Senate to a standstill. After deliberating with his advisers, Tiberius finally reached a verdict. Fulcinius Trio would be permitted to prosecute Piso for crimes in Hispania, while Veranius and Vitellius would prosecute him for murder, alongside a third senator of Tiberius's choosing, Quintus Serveus, the former governor of Commagene appointed by Germanicus. But the emperor was not done. Tiberius insisted on adding further charges to the trial. Piso would also face accusations of disobeying Germanicus's direct order to send legions into Armenia, and of treason or perduelio for raising an army to seize control of Syria. For Piso's wife Plancina, Tiberius added charges of witchcraft, as well as poisoning. Even Piso's youngest son, Marcus, a boy still wearing the toga praetexta, would not be spared, facing charges of suborning the 10th Legion Gemina as they marched from Egypt to Syria. With these additional charges laid out, the trial of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, his wife and his son, was scheduled. Left alone in his portico, Tiberius watched the flock of senators below, making their way back to the waiting Senate. This trial was bound to be ugly, and Tiberius's position was increasingly precarious. Not only did the fate of the empire's stability hang in the balance, but so too did his own imperial authority. The legions on the Rhine, stirred by the death of Germanicus and firmly united behind his widow, were watching closely. The trial of Piso had to be handled with the utmost efficiency. If it failed to placate the soldiers, Tiberius risked losing control of the legions, an outcome that could lead to their march on Rome. In addition to his concerns over the legions, Tiberius's standing with the Roman people was rapidly plummeting. The memory of Germanicus's immense popularity, especially among the lower classes, was taking on an almost mythic life of its own. Rumors that Tiberius had been jealous of Germanicus now cast the hero's death in a far darker light. Just before Germanicus fell ill in Syria, Tiberius had publicly criticized him in the Senate for entering Egypt, in violation of the law that forbade those with imperium from crossing its borders. What Tiberius had meant as a defense of imperial protocol and Rome's stability was now widely interpreted as a signal of imperial disfavor. The Roman people, still grieving their beloved Germanicus, began to suspect that Tiberius himself had orchestrated his removal to make way for his own son, Castor, who had just been granted an ovation. Tiberius now found himself trapped. He was accused of secretly engineering Germanicus's death, and no matter the trial's outcome, he stood to lose. If he yielded to popular opinion, an opinion that had already condemned Piso without evidence, Tiberius would be seen as sacrificing a scapegoat to protect himself. But if Piso were acquitted, Tiberius would be accused of shielding a murderer, further fueling suspicions of a secret alliance to eliminate Germanicus. If this trial had taken place during the reign of Tiberius's father, the outcome would have been swift and simple. Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso would have met an untimely death, whether by suicide, by shipwreck, or by assassination, and Augustus's reputation would have remained unscathed. The imperial system, after all, thrived on plausible deniability. But Tiberius was not Augustus. Unlike his predecessor, Tiberius had a respect for the laws that had once governed the Roman Republic. Piso, as a Roman citizen, was entitled to a fair trial, a right that Tiberius could not ignore, no matter the political stakes. Yet this was not a choice that Augustus's granddaughter, Agrippina, was willing to accept. Furious and impatient, she appeared at Tiberius's villa, demanding to know how much longer he intended to let her husband's murderer walk free. The last surviving daughter of Tiberius's despised ex-wife, Agrippina, had lived lavishly in the east, residing within the royal palaces of the Nabateans, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids. And now she dared to stand before him in Rome, her emperor, and her legal paterfamilias, and dictate what must be done. There was no doubt Agrippina thought as her grandfather had thought. Justice was personal. "And if you are not queen, my dear," Tiberius growled, his voice heavy with contempt, "think you wronged?" Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The Senate convened before dawn, beginning with the traditional auspices. Almost every seat was filled, the air heavy with anticipation. Amidst the flickering light of burning torches, which filled the curia with smoke, senators took their seats. The scratches of scribes echoed in the background as secretaries melted ink cakes and sharpened their quills, all preparing to record every word, every moment of the trial of the century. Piso, Plancina, and Marcus entered the curia, having made their way through a hostile crowd. As they walked from their Palatine villa, the mob hissed and threw vegetables and dung, prompting the Praetorian guards to shelter them beneath a canopy of shields. The family took their seats beside their advocate, the augur Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a kinsman of Piso's who had been compelled by Tiberius to defend him after no other advocates would take the case. Opposite them sat the prosecution, Quintus Veranius, Publius Vitellius, and Quintus Serveus. As daylight crept into the curia and the torches were extinguished, Tiberius entered ceremoniously behind a retinue of lictors. Climbing the dais to the highest curule chair, Tiberius waited until the consuls Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus and Marcus Aurelius Cotta took their curule chairs on the lower dais. After waiting for the commotion in the room to settle, Tiberius spoke. "My fellow senators, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso was my father's representative and his friend. He was appointed on the advice of this august body to assist in administering Rome's eastern provinces. Whether Piso, while in the east, provoked Germanicus by willful opposition and rivalry, whether he rejoiced at his death, or even wickedly destroyed him, these are matters for you to determine with an unbiased mind. If it is proven that a subordinate overstepped the bounds of duty and obedience to his commander, and if he exulted in his commander's death, adding to my personal affliction, I shall despise him and exclude him from my house. But be assured, senators, I would avenge such a personal offence without resorting to my position as princeps. However, if a crime has been committed that demands punishment, no matter the victim's identity, it is for you, senators, to deliver justice, not only for the children of Germanicus, but for us, his grieving parents. Consider also whether Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso dealt with the armies in a revolutionary and seditious spirit. Did he seek, through intrigue and bribery, to curry favour with the soldiers, thereby undermining the authority of Germanicus? Did he attempt to repossess Syria by force? Or are these accusations merely exaggerated falsehoods, deliberately spread by his accusers? As for them, I am justly angered by their intemperate zeal. Why did they strip the corpse of my son, exposing it to the pollution of the vulgar gaze? And why did they circulate among foreigners the story that Germanicus was destroyed by poison, if these allegations remain uncertain and are subject to this very investigation? For my part, I grieve for my son Germanicus, and I will always grieve for him. Yet I will not hinder the accused from presenting all evidence that may prove his innocence, or, if it exists, Germanicus's unfairness. But I caution you all, do not accept as fact any charges that are merely alleged, simply because this case is bound to my own pain and sorrow. To those of you who, through blood ties or personal loyalty, are advocates for Piso, I urge you to assist him in his peril, to the fullest extent of your eloquence and diligence. Likewise, I call upon the prosecutors to show no less effort or persistence. In this, and in this alone, will we place Germanicus above the law, by conducting the inquiry into his death within this house, before the Senate, instead of publicly in the forum, before a bench of judges. In all other respects, let the case against Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, Munatia Plancina, and Marcus Calpurnius Piso be tried as impartially as any other. Let no one be swayed by the tears of my family, or myself, nor by any slanderous stories invented to our discredit.
Because women were not permitted in the Curia during Senate meetings, Agrippina was forced to wait outside with everyone else. Perched on the rostra like a raven, Agrippina, still dressed in her mourning toga, anxiously awaited reports from within the Curia, surrounded by friends, freedmen, an armed escort, and her sons, Nero and Drusus. Inside, her husband's murderers stood trial, and her every sense was attuned to the whispers and movements of those around her. Agrippina would have preferred a standard trial, held in the Forum Romanum before a bench of judges, where the Roman people could witness the proceedings and make their voices heard. But Tiberius had instead called for a Senate trial, behind closed doors, where the anger of the people had no chance to influence the outcome, leaving Agrippina with a growing sense of helplessness as the trial unfolded in the hands of those who owed their allegiance to her enemy. However, the angry crowds that filled the forum, though unable to witness the trial, gave Agrippina a flicker of hope. Lined from the lower Palatine all the way to the doors of the Curia, they hissed venomously as Piso, Plancina, and their son Marcus made their way through the streets of Rome. The family even had to be shielded by the Praetorian Guard from an onslaught of thrown garbage and dung. But the people's fury was unmistakable. But what exactly was happening inside the Curia? Hours dragged on, and still her ally, the Senator Titus Sabinus, had not emerged to report on the proceedings. Every minute stretched into an eternity, and Agrippina's anxiety grew with each passing moment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doors to the Curia creaked open. A few senators trickled out, quickly scattering into the crowd to spread word of the trial's developments. Then, at last, Agrippina caught sight of Titus Sabinus emerging from the mass of bodies. Her pulse quickened as she leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him, the frustration etched across his face, the only clue to the news that he carried. Following a speech given by Tiberius, designed to assure the Senate of his impartiality, the trial began. Fulcinius Trio was the first to present the charges. For nearly 5 hours, Trio delivered a relentless, agonizingly detailed account of every denarius wasted during Piso's time governing Hispania. Though Trio had not personally witnessed Piso's actions in Hispania, it became clear to all that his source of information, so detailed, so specific, had to be Tiberius's Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, the man who controlled an ever-expanding network of spies. As Trio droned on about Piso's endless administrative failings, the senators began to stir restlessly. Some yawned, while others even dozed off. What was Trio playing at? Agrippina wondered. Why waste so much of the prosecution's precious time on these unimportant matters? It was murder Piso needed to be charged with, not maladministration. Was Fulcinius Trio working for the prosecution, or was he secretly working on behalf of the accused? By the time they reached the murder of Germanicus, the exhausted senators would be ready to go home, seeing the trial as nothing more than a witch hunt. But there was more. The reason Fulcinius Trio was allowed to filibuster for 5 hours without interruption was because the Senate, uneasy, hesitated to intervene. On the table before Piso lay a pile of scrolls and documents meant for his defense. Among them, prominently displayed, was a single scroll bearing an unmistakable seal, that of the imperial family. Although the sight of an imperial document among Piso's belongings might have cowed the Senate, a silent warning not to dig too deeply into Germanicus's death, Agrippina was hardly surprised. Her husband had fallen mysteriously ill in Syria only after Tiberius had turned on him in the Senate. But justice would prevail, not only against Piso and Plancina, but against Tiberius as well. Agrippina had Martina, the Syrian poisoner whose testimony on the morrow would convict Piso and Plancina. Once Martina linked the murder of Germanicus to Piso and Plancina, that imperial scroll Piso hid behind would be unsealed, and with it, Tiberius's involvement in Germanicus's death would be laid bare. Then, the doors to the Curia swung open again, and a wave of commotion spilled out into the forum. From within, the shouts of angry senators echoed, punctuated by the commanding voice of Tiberius demanding order. Moments later, Plancina emerged, flanked by a body of Praetorian guards. The crowd erupted into chaos. As Plancina made her way toward the lower Palatine, the mob surged around her, hurling insults and curses, calling her witch and poisoner. The accusations followed her, rising above the din, until Plancina disappeared from view. The enraged crowd, their fury unspent, turned their attention elsewhere. Redirecting their anger, they swarmed a statue of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. With a surge of collective rage, they toppled it to the ground. Then, like an execution procession, they dragged the fallen statue toward the Gemonian stairs, the grim site where Rome's most infamous criminals, thrown from the top, had met their end. This raw display of public sentiment felt like a sign to Agrippina. The people's anger was her ally in this fight for justice. After the first day of the trial ended, Titus Sabinus arrived at the home of Antonia, Agrippina's mother-in-law, accompanied by the prosecutors, Quintus Veranius, Publius Vitellius, and Quintus Serveus. Agrippina, staying there with her children, joined the group for a late supper. Flanked by her sons, Nero and Drusus, she listened intently as the 4 men recounted the day's proceedings in meticulous detail, the weight of each revelation deepening the resolve etched on her face. The chaos that led to Plancina's dramatic exit from the Curia was wholly unexpected. After enduring Fulcinius Trio's exhaustive account of Piso's mismanagement of Hispania, Munatia Plancina made a startling decision. She requested that her trial be conducted separately from her husband's. The reaction was immediate, and none were more shocked than Piso himself. The look on his face said it all. Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso had been publicly abandoned by his own wife. Once Tiberius restored order to the Senate, the trial resumed with Veranius, Vitellius, and Serveus presenting their accusations. Their list of charges painted a damning picture. Piso had disobeyed a direct order from Germanicus, who had commanded Syria's legions, be sent into Armenia. A charge of treason followed for entering the province of another governor, Lucius Marcius Censorinus, the propraetor of Cilicia, and there assembling an army of deserters, slaves, and assassins in a bid to retake Syria by force. To these were added accusations of sacrilege and excess, celebrating the death of Germanicus by offering sacrifices and hosting a lavish feast. Piso responded to each charge with defiance and precision. On the accusation of treason, he argued that his actions had been in service of Rome's interests, maintaining stability in the East, as directed by the Senate. The death of Germanicus, Piso contended, had left a power vacuum which Gaius Sentius Saturninus was only too eager to exploit. Piso had dispatched his eldest son, Gnaeus, to Rome to inform Tiberius personally of his intention to stop Saturninus from completing Germanicus's unrealized agenda, rebuilding the Eastern Empire begun by Germanicus's grandfather, Marcus Antonius, and his wife, Queen Cleopatra. Why else, Piso asked, would Germanicus have entered Egypt, a kingdom nostalgic for his grandfather, whom Germanicus imitated while there? Piso also revealed to the Senate that the new king of Armenia, Zeno Artaxius, placed on the throne by Germanicus himself, was a great-grandson of Marcus Antonius by his eldest daughter, Antonia Hybrida, and her daughter, Pythodorita, the queen of Pontus, Cappadocia, and the Bosporus. Not only was Armenia's king Artaxius a cousin of Germanicus, but so too was the queen of Thrace, Antonia Tryphena, another great-grandchild of Marcus Antonius. And how many of Judea's royal Herods owed their patronage to the family of Germanicus, with whom they had grown up? Clearly, Germanicus, who had also concluded a treaty with Parthia's king Artabanus, was building an Eastern empire, like his grandfather tried to do, while he, Piso, had sought to prevent such an alliance from becoming a threat to Rome. Yet, for this, he was charged with treason. As for the allegations of sacrilege and excess, Piso claimed that his sacrifice, and the subsequent feast, had been in honor of the grandchild born to his eldest son, Gnaeus, and his wife. It was a celebration of life, Piso argued, not an act of defiance. And all the while, the scroll bearing the imperial seal sat there for all to see, never opened and never referenced. As the prosecutors continued briefing Agrippina and her sons on the day's events, a knock echoed at the door. Antonia's servants entered, ushering in 2 Roman guards. "The woman Martina," one of the guards announced, his voice grim. "She's dead." Agrippina's blood ran cold. The guards had been dispatched to retrieve Martina, the Syrian poisoner, from her hidden refuge just outside of Rome. Her testimony the next day was set to seal the fates of both Piso and Plancina. But when the guards arrived, they discovered her lifeless body sprawled on the floor. There was no apparent sign of a struggle, leading the guards to speculate that she may have taken her own life to avoid testifying. Yet, curiously, a full vial of poison remained tucked away in her hair, while no empty vial was found anywhere on the premises. Agrippina's entire case hinged on Martina's testimony. Without her, Piso could still face charges of treason, but those charges could not be extended to Plancina, whose role as a woman was to obey her husband. With Plancina having separated her trial from Piso's, only Martina's testimony could have condemned her. Now, how would they secure a conviction? And more importantly, who, exactly, had betrayed her location? Because the crowd had toppled a statue of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso with the intent of dragging it to the Gemonian stairs, Tiberius confined Agrippina to her home on the second day of the trial, so as not to further incite the crowd. The chaos of the previous day had forced him to temporarily halt proceedings, as senators, already weary from Fulcinius Trio's exhaustive speech and hours of waiting since before dawn, were made to sit even longer while the statue of Piso was re-erected on its plinth. Determined to prevent further disruptions, Tiberius issued an edict barring any nobleman from escorting his widowed daughter-in-law into the Forum Romanum. Without a male escort, Agrippina was forbidden to leave her home, relegated to receiving updates on the trial through handwritten notes delivered by the servants of her allies. Rumours swirled that Munatia Plancina had secured the services of Manius Aemilius Lepidus, grandson of the triumvir Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, as her advocate. But not without difficulty. Much like her husband Piso, Plancina found most advocates unwilling to take her case. Manius Aemilius Lepidus, Agrippina's close friend and cousin, had been forced to accept out of familial obligation. After all, Plancina was his cousin as well. Through a series of reports delivered to her throughout the day, Agrippina reconstructed the events that took place in the Senate. The trial resumed before sunrise. Munatia Plancina and her advocate were seated at their table, while Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the advocate for her husband, occupied the other. Yet Piso himself was conspicuously absent. As the morning auspices were taken, and the creeping daylight gradually extinguished the need for torchlight, the senators waited in growing impatience. Still, Piso had not arrived. Finally, Tiberius dispatched agents to fetch Piso from his residence on the Lower Palatine. After a tense interval, the agents returned, bearing a note. It was handed directly to Tiberius, who listened intently as the agents whispered their report. With a solemn expression, he unfurled the note and began to read silently before the gathered senators. The room, already heavy with anticipation, seemed to hold its breath as Tiberius's face fell, his demeanour turning sombre. "Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso is dead," Tiberius announced gravely to a senate stunned into silence. Holding up the scroll, he paused, drawing a steadying breath before reading aloud.
"Crushed by a conspiracy of my foes, and the odium excited by a lying charge, since my truth or innocence find no place here, I call upon the immortal gods to witness that, toward you, Caesar, I have lived loyally and with like dutiful respect toward your mother. I implore you to think of my children, one of whom, Gnaeus, is in no way implicated in my career, such as it was, seeing that all this time he has been in Rome, while the other son, Marcus, desperately tried to dissuade me from returning to Syria. Would that I had yielded to my young son, rather than he to his aged father. Therefore I pray the more earnestly that the innocent may not pay the penalty of my wickedness. By 45 years of obedience, and by my association with you in the consulate, as one who formerly won the esteem of the divine Augustus your father, as one who is your friend, and will never hereafter ask a favour, I implore you to save my unhappy sons."
Tiberius then lowered the scroll, his eyes scanning the senators. These are the words of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, written before he killed himself. Tiberius then turned to Plancina. Why didn't he wait? 2 days still remained to him to prove his innocence. When Plancina said nothing, Tiberius's face pinched. "He did this to punish me," he fumed, "to make me look bad. The only reason one takes their own life before seeing the trial to its conclusion is to cast odium upon the judge. In his actions, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso accuses me of forsaking legal impartiality, though I have, as of yet, passed no judgment." Lowering the last of her handwritten notes, Agrippina sat in silence, her mind racing with unanswered questions. With Piso dead, there would be no public reckoning for the death of her husband, no justice for Germanicus. The trial had lost its weight, and with it, the hopes of holding someone accountable for those crimes committed in the East. Worse yet, without Martina, how could the case against Plancina proceed? After detaching her trial from her husband's, would she now walk free? But there was something else that gnawed at Agrippina's thoughts, something even more pressing. What of the scroll with the imperial seal? Would it ever be opened to reveal Tiberius's role in her husband's death?
Tiberius had underestimated Agrippina. He had seen the crowds gathered around her in the Forum Romanum on the first day of Piso's trial, chanting her name, calling for justice for Germanicus. From the moment Tiberius's son died, his widowed daughter-in-law had cloaked herself in the mantle of public mourning, showing herself to the people as the abused last granddaughter of the divine Augustus, a woman whose husband became yet another victim of the Claudian dynasty's unchecked power. Her mother Julia and her brothers Gaius Caesar, Lucius Caesar, and posthumous Agrippa, all casualties of intrigue and ambition. And now Germanicus. Tiberius could still hear the shouts of the people as the news of Piso's death disseminated through the crowds outside the Curia. Justice for Germanicus, and hail Agrippina. Every word a blade. Even restricted to her home, she continued to loom large in the minds of the Roman people. She had positioned herself perfectly, untouchable in her grief, exalted by the love of the plebs and the unwavering loyalty of her late husband's Rhine legions. There was no maneuver Tiberius could make that would not tighten the noose his daughter-in-law had so artfully placed around his neck. To challenge Agrippina would be to risk inciting rebellion. To indulge her was to invite further demands. Piso's trial had been his chance to deflect blame and quiet the city's unrest. But now Piso was dead. There was no one left to hold accountable, save himself. By now Agrippina would have received the news, an account of Piso's death, written in hurried notes by one of her many allies. Would she see this as her triumph? Perhaps, but Tiberius doubted it. Agrippina's grief was too perfectly weaponized, too carefully wielded against him to allow the matter to rest here. Justice had been deprived of its spectacle, and the anger of the people would burn brighter for it. And the senators were waiting for him to speak, waiting for a decision. Slowly he rose to his feet, his shadow stretching long across the Senate floor. "Senators," Tiberius began, his voice low but steady, "justice for Germanicus is owed to the people of Rome." He paused, the words bitter on his tongue. "What is to be done?" The chamber murmured as the senators exchanged uncertain glances. After a brief discussion with the prosecuting advocates, the consul Marcus Aurelius Cotta turned to address the assembly. "Above all else," Cotta began, loud enough for every senator to hear, "the Senate wishes to express its gratitude to the immortal gods for safeguarding the present state of our republic, greater than we could ever have desired, and preserved for us by the favor of our princeps, Tiberius Caesar." Cotta's gaze swept across the chamber before continuing. "The Senate also admires the princeps' fairness and forbearance. Though Piso's crimes are undeniable, and though he thought to elude justice through his own punishment, we are in agreement with Tiberius Caesar. The trial against Piso must continue." And so the prosecution of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, Munatia Plancina, and Marcus Calpurnius Piso continued, undeterred by Piso's untimely death and the loss of the prosecution's star witness against Plancina. Yet, by the trial's conclusion, the Senate rendered its verdict. All were found guilty. Tiberius knew she would come to him following the close of the trial, and she did at night as expected, when few would notice her visit. The dimly lit halls of the Palatium were empty, save for the occasional echo of a servant's footsteps. He had anticipated this visit, knew it was coming from the moment Piso's suspicions about Germanicus were aired in the Senate. But now, standing at the threshold of his private chambers, Tiberius felt the sting of failure, sharper than he had anticipated. The trial had not gone as he had hoped. Piso's death had stolen the spectacle, and Tiberius now stood, exposed. "Mother," he said, his voice cold. Julia Augusta stepped into the room, her presence formidable even in her advancing years. Though she carried herself with the weight of authority, there was a tremor of fear behind her eyes. "Have you come to congratulate me then?" he asked, voice resigned. "I've come to beg for the life of Plancina," Julia Augusta answered, easing herself into a chair. She sat in silence for a few moments as she worked up her courage. "You allowed Germanicus and Agrippina to build their empire in the east," she explained, her voice low but heavy with long-held fears. "Did you think they would not come for us? What would Agrippina do to you, to me? She's the last of a family who has been trying to destroy us for 30 years. Tiberius turned his gaze on her. "And do you have reason to fear Agrippina?" His mother did not answer. She looked down. "Piso and Plancina understood," she bleated. "They saw what you failed to see. Germanicus and Agrippina were raising a faction against you. Everything Piso and Plancina did was for your protection, as well as for the protection and stability of Rome." Her words struck deep. Tiberius's mother, who had groomed him from birth for this singular purpose, had instead viewed Piso and Plancina as her protectors rather than himself. He met her gaze. "It's a pity you never trusted me," he said. "You always had to negotiate the path for me, didn't you? Gaius, Lucius, Julilla, Posthumus, all conveniently removed. But it was your fear of Agrippina's vengeance that threatened me, not my trust in Germanicus. You chose the wrong protector. I sent Germanicus east specifically for his blood ties, and it was I who chose Zeno Artaxius for Armenia's throne, not Germanicus. And now, thanks to your involvement, Agrippina truly is a threat. And since the imperial seal has been seen by the whole of the Senate among Piso's belongings, the ruin of Augustus's family is now laid at my feet." Once again, Tiberius sat before a crowded Senate prepared to deliver its judgment. After reviewing the documents and orders written by Germanicus, began the consul Aurelius Cotta, who himself declared Piso the author of his death, and after listening to the evidence produced by Piso's accusers, and upon hearing Piso's defense, we, the Senate, have reached the conclusion that the remarkable forbearance and restraint of Germanicus Caesar was overborne by the savagery of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. Piso ignored the majesty of the imperial family, and the law of the land that states the imperium of Germanicus Caesar in every land he entered was the highest in that land, excepting that of Tiberius himself. Piso conducted himself in Syria as though he had absolute authority, and was corrupted by the great gifts of Vonones, who sought the death of the Armenian king placed on the throne by Germanicus. Piso stirred up civil war in Cilicia, despite civil war being laid to rest by the divine Augustus. And he did rejoice at the death of Germanicus Caesar, holding banquets during the time when the announcement was spreading across the land. The Senate finds that in these most manifest acts, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso has violated the divinity of the deified Augustus. Cotta took a breath, then continued, "In taking his own life, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso did not exact the punishment he deserved, but rather sought to escape a greater one. And so the Senate moves to add to that punishment the edict that no lamentations be allowed by the women who would normally mourn him according to ancient custom, that his statues, wherever erected, be removed, that his portrait masks not be displayed at funerals or parades by any person claiming descent from the Calpurnius family, that all the properties of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso be confiscated and returned to the princeps Tiberius Caesar, from whose father Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso received the lands in the first place, that the name Gnaeus may no longer be used within the Calpurnius family, that the younger Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso be compelled to legally change his name, that Piso's wife, Munatia Plancina, and youngest son, Marcus Calpurnius Piso, be denied fire or water anywhere in Italia for a period to last no less than 10 years. Tiberius said nothing for several long minutes. He sat without moving as the Senate, their eyes wide, fidgeted in their seats. Finally, Tiberius stood. "Your judgment is harsh, August Fathers," he said. "Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso killed himself because he believed himself already condemned by me. And yet these are your words, senators. It is you who condemn him with a damnatio memoriae, not I. But it is I whom history will judge as cruel, not you." Tiberius sat back down before continuing. "You ask me for the damnation of his memory by striking the name Calpurnius Piso from all public records and removing all statues, that posterity will never know he existed. Yet Marcus Antonius, who led Egypt to war against Rome, was not so stricken. His son, Iulus Antonius, who defiled the house of my father, did not have his name erased from history. But you think because this case is intimately tied to my sorrow, I will be flattered by such requests. Let me assure you, conscript fathers, I am not. Neither will I move to have the Piso name stricken from all public record. As for Marcus Calpurnius Piso, what choice does a youth have but to follow the will of his father? Is that not the first and most important law, that of the paterfamilias? Can we expect children to obey their parents only until they disagree with them? Does that not lead to our children sitting in judgment as though they were the adults rather than children? No, Marcus Piso will not be exiled from Rome. I find that, having advised his father against returning to Syria, he acted with the appropriate pietas due all fathers from their children, and for that he will not be punished." Then he turned back to face the Senate. "Tell me, conscript fathers," he continued, "why should a man charged with nothing lose everything he owns? The younger Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso was here in Rome the entire time his father pursued his course. Those properties you are so eager to strip away are this young man's future and his livelihood, a man who has committed no crime. Confiscating his future will not return my son to me. Young Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso will inherit the fullness of his father's estate, though I would personally feel obliged," Tiberius said, a change of tone to his voice, "if he would consent to change his name, so that when he takes his seat in this Senate, I am not daily forced to address him by the name associated with the death of my son." At last, Tiberius turned to face Plancina. His eyes fell and his cheeks flushed scarlet. "As for Piso's wife," he began shamefaced, "I request the Senate mitigate Plancina's exile, much as I believe it is deserved, at the personal request of my mother, the Augusta, who in return for her many kindnesses to the men who sit in this body, begs intercession for Plancina, hoping the Senate will remember how rarely she has ever sought to use her rightful influence." With that, the senators came together to murmur in hushed whispers. Finally, a unanimous nodding of the heads confirmed Tiberius's recommendation. Munatia Plancina was free. For an hour after Plancina stoically walked out of the Curia, speeches were made to commemorate Tiberius's clemency. The consul Messallinus moved to have a gold statue placed in the temple of Mars the Avenger to commemorate the vindication of Germanicus's death. Aulus Caecina Severus, Germanicus's former general in Germania, not to be outdone by Messallinus, motioned to have an altar dedicated to vengeance for the same reason. But Tiberius stopped them all. Looking out at the room of hypocrites, praising clemency and honour after having passed such cruel punishments, Tiberius's mouth turned down. "Victories over foreigners are commemorated with monuments," he said flatly. "Domestic woes should be shrouded. in grief.